Um, so I guess we can start off with a little bit about ourselves and our experience with Islandora. So for me, my experience with Islandora has been about 3 years, mostly working on metadata cleanup in Whitman College in our repository Arminda.
Hi, I'm Michelle Janowiecki, and I've been working on an Islandora pilot project for 2 years. It might be closer to 3 years now at Johns Hopkins. And then I just put my contact info in case you want to get a hold of me after this presentation or anything.
So we're going to start with pre-migration stuff for metadata.
So one of the first things you need to think about for migration is how to gather your data, like where your data is and how to get it into a format that is useful to you. At Hopkins, we had 2 main places where our metadata was. It was either in DSpace, and we had some metadata that was still in MARC records. So I just have these 2 Python scripts as examples of how I got metadata out of either the JSON or MARC format and then converted it to a CSV. And that was kind of how our project got started. So if you're comfortable with Python, I would recommend it. Of course, for MARC, you can also use something like MARC Edit, and there are a lot of tutorials on that. And that's a little bit more user-friendly than just jumping straight into PyMarc. And both those scripts are public if anyone is interested. Paige?
And for us at Whitman, the majority of our metadata was in spreadsheets from previous migrations. And so what we did is that we just utilized those spreadsheets and updated them. Because when we were in Islandora 7, we didn't update our spreadsheets in all of our collections. So it was just easier for us to go back and update them and use them for our migration. So it's definitely recommended if you have spreadsheets to use them, even if they're outdated, because it's a lot better than starting from scratch. We also looked at our twig and mods. This was really helpful when you just want to get a list of all the fields you're using. It was a really good way to make sure you didn't forget anything. It's also possible if you don't have a spreadsheet, it's possible to download all of your mods and combine them into a large documentation, but that's not advised because it takes a lot of time and I don't want anybody to suffer through that. And so if you don't have a spreadsheet, Mark Jordan has a CSV module that I've heard great things about. And so all else fails, use that as opposed to trying to combine your mods together.
So at this point, we just thought we would kind of go over the basics of Islandora metadata to provide some context for the rest of the workshop. So this is kind of like the way I understand it in my mental map. It's maybe like not as like technically accurate, but I find thinking of the entities in Islandora this way to be really helpful. So there are like 3 major types of entities that are important to understand and know. The first are media entities, and the media entities in Islandora is the entity that holds your files and the metadata about that file. So it's like a container and it has metadata about a file, and that is a media. And then we have content entities. You can like create your own content entities, but the 2 default ones that come with Islandora are the repository items, which holds content or like metadata content about a single repository item or like a single digital asset or digital object, whatever you typically call it. And then we have collections, and that holds metadata about a group of repository items. So those are, I think, frequently used in the digital world. So those to me made the most sense. And then we have taxonomy vocabulary terms. And even though these are like technically content entities, I like to think of them a little bit separately. So these are entities that aren't describing a resource, but are something that you want to have multiple fields about, like a person, a corporate body, subject, place, and each taxonomy can represent a different type of entity in that way. And then you can link those into your media entities and content entities. Paige, if you could click the next slide. And I made some diagrams that hopefully will be helpful. So this is like an example diagram of entities you could have in your Islandora instance. It wouldn't have to look exactly like that because Islandora is so customizable. But you can see over here, we have our content entities in blue, repository item collection, media entities, and then we have various types. So audio, document, extracted text, file, image, video. And then these taxonomy vocabularies are from Hopkins, but you can decide what taxonomies you want to create and how do you want to define them. So for instance, like we have stuff like corporate body, genre, form, language, resource type, and then some like Islandora specific ones like Islandora access, Islandora display, as different categories of taxonomy vocabularies. Next slide, thanks. And then I also kind of created this diagram that hopefully is helpful. And if folks have questions at any point, just feel free to type in the chat. But this is just trying to show the relationships in a visual way between the different entities. So the entities here are these curved boxes. And you see we have our repository item, a collection, a media, and a taxonomy vocabulary term. And then the fields are in this pink circle. So for instance, you can see the media has a relationship with the repository item through the field media of. So your media has a field called media of that's filled by the repository item. And it's the same relationship between a repository item and a collection. A repository item can be a member of a collection. And then you can see these, I put fields coming off each entity, and that is just to represent the fact that each entity itself has its own fields and each field has a field type. And you can see here that I just have a generic field for the relationship between the repository item and the taxonomy vocabulary term. Essentially, the main place where your relationships are going, the only place where your relationships are going to happen between taxonomies and other entities is taxonomies tend to be a value of a field. So if we look at a real life example, hopefully that will clarify that. So that's on the next page. So here's like an actual example. And let me put the link in the chat really quick so you guys can see it. This is from Hopkins Digital Library. And let me put that in. So here we have a repository item called Catching a Brainwave. And that is a member of the collection called Johns Hopkins Science Review, which is like an educational television program that we have. And here's like an example field of the collection. So in our collection, we have like a field called Finding Aid, and that has a value. And that value is our link to archive space. And you can see here that the field data type changed to link. And then we can look at the relationships between the repository item and the media. So the media has a field called has size, and that has a value of 2.21 gigabytes, and that has a data type of a number. You can also see here that the media file is just existing within this media container. And then up here, you can kind of see how the repository items relate to the taxonomies. So we have a field called subject here that exists within the repository item, and that has a field type of an entity reference, which means that that field is not going to have string values. It's always going to reference a different entity. And in that case, it is a taxonomy. So we have a taxonomy vocabulary term that is a subject, and with the name of brain -- magnetic fields. And that taxonomy term has a field called authority sources, and that is a special Islandora data type called authority link. And you can see that the value of that field is a fast and then the URI for that fast term. So these are kind of how your interrelationships are built up. And I think it's important as you start planning your migration to feel like you have a good grasp of kind of like how everything interrelates together for your particular setup and your materials. So when you are creating your own local Islandora 8 schema, you're going to kind of want to go through each type of entity and ask yourself certain questions about like how you want to implement metadata schema locally and like what changes you might want to make to the default, assuming you keep repository item and collection as content entity types. You want to select all of your metadata elements or fields, and then you want to, we're back. Okay. No, it's fine. You want to determine the repeatability of your elements. And I see here that I have a note to check for documentation. I was going to add a link here. Apologies. You want to determine the requiredness of all your elements. So like, do I want to make this field required for when I create a repository item? Like, does title need to be required? Does date need to be required? Subject, etc. And then you need to figure out what the data type for all the elements are. And there is some documentation that I will find and put in the chat about the different field types in Islandora. And you kind of need to just go through and think about like, is this going to contain a string? Is this going to contain an entity? Like, what should this field be formatted like? Or is it like going to contain a date? And then you just need to do the exact same thing for collections. Go through each element and decide what fields you need, if they're going to be repeatable, if they're going to be required, and what the data type is going to be.
And I would say, kind of talking about taxonomy vocabularies, you're able to do something very similar. You can set up whether or not you want terms to be repeatable, if it's a required field. And so it's set up pretty much the same way, which is pretty nice. And then switching a little bit, talking about entity relationships. I have to admit, this is something that takes me a while to wrap my head around. So when you go into, and the best thing I can do is explain it in an example. And so let's say you go into your subject field, and in your subject field, you have the option to set your data type. And one data type you can select is entity relationship, or entity resource, I believe. Or excuse me, entity reference. I knew it was the R. So one option you can select is entity reference. And what this means is that it essentially limits what type of data you can put into that subject field. Now, if you go in and edit your subject field, you can go and select entity reference taxonomy. And so basically what this means is that you're saying, okay, I only want taxonomy terms to go into my subject field. So even if you want to go in and create a new term, so let's say you want to create Alexandre Dumas on the fly, you won't be able to do that directly in the form because it says it has to be an existing taxonomy term. And so before you do that, you have to do a whole bunch of other stuff, but that's essentially kind of what entity relationships is. It limits what you can put into your metadata in a good way, but also in a different way.
Yeah, and then like once you have your schema mapped in Islandora, you need to start to think about how you plan to clean up your data, and like what data needs to be cleaned up and what doesn't. And here I just wanted to talk a little bit about what Python can potentially do for cleaning up your data, if that's something you're comfortable with. Some of the things I used it for in our pilot project and migration was getting URIs for controlled vocabulary terms using APIs. So we had a bunch of strings from our old digital repository DSpace for subjects and for locations and for people. So what I did is I like got API information about like the Library of Congress name authority files, VIAF, FAST, and just kind of like ran all of those strings through and saw what matches came up. And then if we didn't get 100% match on certain like subject terms or people, which there's definitely a lot we didn't, we went through and did that manually and found matches. I also used regex to normalize our dates. We had dates like written out, but like in 10 different ways. So that's regular expressions. It's a shorthand. And that's actually available in a lot of different programming languages. So you don't necessarily need to know Python, but it's a way of finding patterns within strings and then grabbing sections of that pattern, of those patterns, and reorganizing it. So you can say like, can you please look for this format, and then like flip it around. That way it's like an ISO date. So I did that. Let's see. And then Python's really helpful for just like big reshuffling of spreadsheets. So sometimes I had a bunch, like 10 or 20 spreadsheets that I wanted to just combine in one spreadsheet, or I wanted to merge spreadsheets and identifiers. And the pandas library is a library you can use with Python, and that is just super useful to do big tasks like that. So I use that a lot, and there's a lot of documentation online about how to use pandas. It's one of the more intuitive Python libraries out there, I found. And there are also tutorials written by librarians as well. And then I also just used it for like some validity checking to make sure that the data was fine, because it's a lot to like manually view data. So there's a pandas function to find any duplicate values or rows. And then there's a panda function to delete like blank columns or blank rows. There's also Python functions to like test the validity of links and just see if you get like a 200 response by using the request module. So I did that. And then Paige, if you wouldn't mind clicking on this repo, I put a link here to my repo with some of my metadata editing scripts. And no worries if you can't click on it. Sorry. And this is like public. So if you're interested or having questions in like the types of scripts I was talking about, feel free to clone or fork it, or message me. And then I have like some basic descriptions of what this is. I just wouldn't recommend relying on just like copy and pasting scripts from this repo itself. I would definitely clone or fork it because I change it a lot. So if you want your own copy, that's what I'd recommend. But yeah, Python can be super useful if you're familiar with it. And that's it. That's all I have for Python right now.
And so at Whitman, we used OpenRefine to help clean up our spreadsheets, although Python and Panda sound amazing. I wish I could do that. But we used OpenRefine and Google Sheets to clean up our spreadsheets. In OpenRefine, it was great because it allowed us to do essentially the same work on all of our spreadsheets. So we have a series of honors theses that each year is separated out by its own spreadsheet. And so when we were cleaning up our metadata, essentially we were doing the same work on every single spreadsheet. And so instead of having to do all of that repetitive work, OpenRefine is great because all I had to do was import one spreadsheet, do all of my changes, and OpenRefine keeps track of my changes. And so all I would have to do is upload the next spreadsheet and apply those changes. And so it's a great way to quickly clean up some changes, especially if you're doing the same thing over and over again. I'd also mention Google Sheets as it's good at some little things like trimming white spaces. I realize I put adding prefixes, but that's nothing to do with cleaning data. But it can add prefixes. But for us, Google Sheets was great in that it allowed us to manually clean things up. And so how Michelle was saying how it's kind of challenging, you were talking specifically about finding duplicates. We were doing it manually in Google Sheets. And so that's kind of what we used for cleaning up our data.
Yeah, and then like one thing you should be thinking about probably at the same time you're like wrapping up creating your schema and you're thinking about cleaning up your metadata is the actual mapping process. So you're going to need to map all of your old fields to your new fields, and you need to like ask yourself some questions like, am I going to take all of the old fields into Islandora? Are there any fields I need to add before migration? So Islandora specific fields, or just like new fields that you want to incorporate at this time. For instance, we added a copyright field with the right statement.org information to all of our digital objects, and we did not have that previously. And then you kind of also just like want to think about what fields have taxonomy terms as values, because that's going to require potentially like a different kind of cleanup on those particular fields and values.
One thing we wanted to point out here, I know that Chris and Dara mentioned it the other day too, but you want to make sure that when you create your fields in Islandora 8, you're very careful with how you set them up, because once you start adding content to your fields, there's no easy way to change them. So a really good example that kind of came up is looking at your character limits. So let's say you set your field up to have a character limit of 25. And then later you start adding metadata and you realize you have character limits of 26. There's no easy way to change that character limit. And so just be very mindful when you start mapping your metadata and cleaning your metadata that you're really thinking about everything that you have. And so along with creating your metadata, and not creating your metadata, along with mapping your schema and mapping your metadata, we also wanted to provide the metadata interest group documentation. This is a great resource to use if you're just starting out in this process, because this documentation is really well written. It was written by Talay, Rosie, and Mike, the previous co-conveners of MIG, and they did a great job thinking about everything regarding metadata. And so I highly recommend you going here if you want to find a starting place. And also what's good to note is that this is not going to map everything that you have. And so we also provided some schemas that you might want to look at to kind of help you fill out your personalized mapping.
Yeah, and then we're going to talk about how to document your schema. We both had different approaches that I think both work well. It just is totally up to your preference. I'm going to talk a little bit about Airtable, and I'm going to share my screen really quick. So this might sound like an ad for Airtable, for which I apologize. I just really love it. So Airtable is a kind of like a spreadsheet database management platform that just has like a really friendly user interface and is really great for documentation. And you can create a free account, although you will not have like all of the features. I have a free account though, so you'll have all the features you'll see here, but there are like more that you can add and like extensions to Airspace. So here is like the Hopkins Digital Library metadata schema, and a few features of Airtable I really like is one, you have you can add descriptions to your tables and to your fields, so and to the whole Airtable as a whole. So this is like the base guide, and here you can put in information, documentation, and this is all in Markdown. So anything you can do in Markdown, you can add in these descriptions. And then like for instance, here I have just descriptions of all my entities. But let's go over to repository items. So this is the metadata schema for repository item. As you can see, I put little like information for each column header explaining like what the field is. For instance, field data type, I explain like this tells you what kind of data is allowed in the field. And then there's a really cool feature within Airtable called, I think it's called like linked field. So it means you can link to other tables. So this column is actually the values are actually linking to another table. So if I click on taxonomy term, I can get more information. So I can get like the machine name of like what the data type is, and then a definition, and then an example, and then links to documentation. And so if you are a librarian trying to figure out the schema, you can have a lot of options to click on stuff. So for instance, access rights is a field we have in repository item, and then it accepts a taxonomy term, but it only accepts certain ones. So here I have like listed. So this is like another table. I have my table of taxonomies. So it's really useful to be able to have these click throughs. And there's also really nice ways to do controlled lists. So here for repeatability and requirements, like you see these color coded terms, and that was me setting a controlled list. So you can only pick like repeatable or not repeatable. And then you also have fields or columns that you can set to have markdown enabled, like rich text description. So here, this is nice because you can add links, you can bold things. And so I find that to be really great for instructions. And then the last thing I just wanted to talk about is the views. So the views are like alternative ways to view the same information. So let's say I'm a metadata librarian. I've kind of like looked through the schema. I think I understand it, but I'm like, why isn't this alphabetized? You can click here and see it in alphabetized order. And then you can also do like more fun views. So this is like a grouping of all the required fields as cards. And then like you can click through and see. And then I did this just for every entity. So like for corporate body, I have my metadata schema and, all the same columns and my different views. So it's a good way to organize information. And then I also have instructions for how to do our CSV migration as well, which is why there are so many tables in this. But yeah, that's Airtable. I would highly recommend just at least checking it out. I'm like low-key obsessed with it now. So that's my unsponsored ad for Airtable. I'm not associated with them, except for like my undying love. And I'm gonna stop sharing.
Yeah, as soon as when I heard Michelle was doing this, I was like, I'm excited because it's just amazing. Because at Whitman, we use spreadsheets and Google Docs. This was really helpful for us because, as I said, all of our metadata was on spreadsheets. And so we had spreadsheets open all the time. So it was just something else for me to use. And it was easy to use because I could share it with my colleagues and we could work on it together. The other great thing is that I was able to use equations to essentially pull from our schema into other spreadsheets. And so it was a really great way to connect everything together. Another thing that I used and would recommend is Protege. Protege is an ontology, and I don't know if I used it correctly, but it was a really great tool to use when documenting your schema, because it allows you to link from one schema to another kind of seamlessly, and it allows you to provide a lot of details to it. The bad side or the downside is that you have to remember that you're using it. I always forgot that we were using Protege, and so I never updated it. But it is a great tool to use, and so I would definitely recommend that. Just remembered that you're using it. And now we're going to talk about our metadata for the actual migration.
Yeah, so I'll just give like a brief overview of what we used for migration. We had a custom migration module that migrated our metadata and files via CSV on like a GUI interface. It was built using 3 modules: Drupal migrate module, migrate source UI, and migrate source CSV at Hopkins. And essentially the process is you create a CSV for each entity type, like repository item, person, video, like each media type, each taxonomy type, in each content entity type. And then you upload them on an Islandora GUI page when you're logged in at a certain permission level. And the capabilities are, it validates reference entities. So if you try to refer to a taxonomy in a field that doesn't exist, it will yell at you and be like, that doesn't exist, you can't do that. And it can update existing entities. So if you have your spreadsheet full of information about repository items, and then you want to make changes to a bunch of like different records, you can make changes in your spreadsheet and just upload it again, and all your problems will be fixed. And again, it does provide some error messages. Sometimes they're a little puzzling to figure out, but most of the time it's pretty helpful.
And at Whitman, we used the Islandora Workbench. Yesterday, Aaron and I talked about this a little bit. It was part of the grant work that we were involved in at Whitman. But we use Workbench, and I can say that if you want to know more about it, the documentation is absolutely amazing, and I cannot do it any kind of justice. So if you want to know about it, we have a link to the documentation. One thing that I do want to say is that when you're working with Workbench and using Google Spreadsheets, your fields have to be set up in a very specific way in order for it to work. And I'll go into that a little bit later.
Yeah, so here I was just going to give like a little bit more in-depth presentation, little spiel about our custom migration module, which I think our dream is to eventually contribute it to the Islandora community, but I'm not sure like what the like concrete plans to do that are, but I do hope it happens eventually. So this is like a snippet of an example spreadsheet for our corporate bodies. Up here at the top, you would have headers, but those are just cut off. But essentially you have this migrate UI within your Islandora site. You pick whatever it is. So I picked a corporate body, support CSV, you upload the file, you hit migrate, you see a little like screen that is showing you your progress. It's like a little progress bar. Once it's done, it tells you how many successfully uploaded, how many errors you got. And then if there are errors, there's a link you can click, and then it will like try to explain it to you in its machine-like way. And then hopefully you can fix any errors. And then you just upload that same spreadsheet again with the fixed errors, and it will correct your mistakes. I would say for, you know, basic spreadsheets like repository items, taxonomy terms that just have metadata, like 1,000 rows takes, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes. But for our media spreadsheets, those link to some like public URL with the file already available. So either like AWS, or for instance, we were just pointing to our DSpace files, bitstreams online, and that's significantly slower. So you might have to leave your screen open for quite a while. For instance, I would do like batches of 30 videos at a time because that's all it could handle without timing out. But then I could do about 1,000 photographs at a time, and then probably a few thousand PDFs depending on the size. So it just really depended on the size of the file you were trying to upload, and it would create derivatives for you as it's doing that. It was a lot of troubleshooting to figure that out though. And then I just wanted to explain our lookup system in the migration module. This is just a basic example, but any field that has a value that's referencing a different entity, there's a certain structure, formatting structure to allow the migration module to understand what you're talking about. So for instance, let's say I have a whole collection. I'll always upload my taxonomy terms first, and the taxonomy terms, all entities have a unique ID that we assign them before migration. It's just a UUID. You can generate them using websites or Python. So for this, I have a subject taxonomy term called telescopes with this unique ID. And then in my repository item, CSV, let's say I have 4 items and they all have the subject. So there's multiple different ways of referring to it, referring to that subject once it's been ingested. One is, this is like the most spelled out way to reference that entity, that taxonomy term, is to do taxonomy term, subject. And then you do the field, unique ID, then unique ID. But a lot of times you have default sets. So for instance, it knows that in the subject field that you're always going to be looking for taxonomy terms. So you can skip that and just put a colon and then put subject, unique ID, unique ID. But it also knows that the default for the field is unique ID. So you can skip that as well and just have your 2 colons next to each other. Alternatively, you can look up your terms by another field. So we have the name field up here in the subject taxonomy, and as long as that's unique, you can use it. So if I don't want to type out a unique ID that is unreadable by humans, I can type out telescopes as long as I change that field. And that is also how we link repository items and collections, is through this quad lookup format, as well as linking the media to the repository items. So it is like a little complicated, but the nice thing about it is if it cannot find via your quad lookup the thing in the system, it does error out. So you don't have like any mistakes made during the migration process. So that's that.
So kind of switching gears a little bit back to Workbench. It's a little bit similar to what Michelle was describing for our spreadsheets. For us, because we were using spreadsheets and because how our instance was set up, we were able to add new terms when spreadsheets were ingested into Islandora 8. And so for us, that meant all we had to do for certain fields was add prefixes ahead of it. A good example is looking at our subject field. And again, just like Michelle, the header was cut off so that people could actually read what I had. And so for our instance, our subject field is using different taxonomy vocabularies. And so for one field, we're referencing corporate bodies, families, and generic subject. And so for our spreadsheets, we had to make sure that we indicated what term went into which taxonomy vocabulary. And so an example would be looking at Toni Morrison. So we have the subject heading Toni Morrison, and we want to make sure that when this item is uploaded into Islandora 8, that Toni Morrison goes into the person taxonomy vocabulary. And so that's why we have a prefix that says person. So that way, when this item is ingested, Toni Morrison goes into the person taxonomy vocabulary. Now, this isn't for all of our collections, or this isn't for all of our fields, or specifically, this is only for our linked agent field. It's not for everything. This is only something that you want for linked agent fields. But it's not for every linked agent field. So if you look at geographic location, so for us, our instance was set up so that the geographic location field only used one taxonomy vocabulary, geographic location. And so what we did is in our fields in spreadsheets, we didn't have to prefix them with anything. We could just put the terms out. And when it was ingested into Islandora 8, all those terms were added into the correct taxonomy vocabulary because there was only one to go from. And then one thing I had to mention was how linked agents was set up, because this was completely different than anything that we'd really dealt with at Whitman. So similar to the subject taxonomy I was just talking about, linked agents deals with multiple different taxonomy vocabularies. So it deals with corporate body, family, and person. And so much like our subject field, when we created our linked agent field in our spreadsheets, we had to make sure that we had added the little prefix that said, this person goes into this taxonomy or this person goes into this taxonomy vocabulary when this item is ingested. And so a good example is looking at Janet Davis. Janet Davis is a person, and we want to make sure when we ingest this into Islandora 8, she goes into the person taxonomy. Now, the one thing that's different about this field is that we have relators. And so what we want to do is that when we, in our Islandora instance, we don't just want to see a list of people's names, because you can't, you want to make sure you identify who's the creator and who's the advisor. And so to do that in Workbench, what you do, or what we did, is added the relator in front of the taxonomy vocabulary prefix. And so for going back to Janet Davis example, they are an advisor. And so they had our local prefix that identifies them as an advisor. And so when it is ingested into Islandora 8, not only will her name go into the subject, or not only will her name go into the person taxonomy vocabulary, but when our users look at this item on the front end, there will be right next to their name, it'll say advisor. And so it clearly states out who that person is. And it's the same thing with creators as well. If you look at, believe we have in the conferences shared drive, I think there is a example of messy metadata, and it shows the different type of prefixes you need to use for linked agents, because it can look really confusing, but after you work with it a while, it kind of makes sense. One thing that I do want to mention is that you want to make sure when dealing with linked agents, you want to make sure that you really know what you really want to make sure where you know where stuff is going. I know that sounds really weird. But for example, I know that I know that Janet Davis is going into a person taxonomy vocabulary, but there'll be times when people make a mistake, because we're all human, and you forget to add in that prefix. I don't know where that goes, because we have 3 taxonomy vocabularies to look from. And so, as I like to say, it kind of goes into vocabulary limbo. And so you want to be careful when you work with things like this, because if you forget something, it can either go into taxonomy limbo or it might not work. Because I think what happened for us when we were figuring out the bugs of Workbench, I think if you misspelled something, like if you misspelled corporate body, or if you forgot the S on relators, it crashed when you tried to ingest it. So basically, this is a long way of me saying Workbench in Islandora 8 is very particular on how you set up your fields. And so just be ready for things to not work correctly the first time, because it's a lot of small details that you have to pay close attention to every single time. So now we're going to talk about post-migration. And so for us, we are currently live in Islandora 8 at Whitman. And so the only editing I've been able to do is manually editing, because we have a whole bunch of things going on and I want to make sure nothing breaks on my end. And so one thing I want to mention, when you go in and edit your data in Islandora 8, specifically I'm talking about when you edit your taxonomy vocabularies or linked agents in Islandora 8, there is no easy way to move terms from one taxonomy vocabulary to another. And so what I mean by that is that, let's say we made a mistake and accidentally put Toni Morrison's name into the subject taxonomy vocabulary. Well, there is no direct way for you in Islandora 8 to say, hey, I want to move Toni Morrison from subject into person. There's going to have to be a more complex way that involves deleting the term and re-adding the term. And what I did is that instead of having to explain it, because it's a little complicated, I created a little video based off of the sandbox on how I've kind of approached this. One thing I definitely want to say is that, and this, our slides will be available after. So, and I think it's available on YouTube somewhere. So you can watch it later. But I do want to say that when you look at it, or if you look at it, just keep in mind that this is just a sandbox example. It's not going to be like your actual repository. When I go in and edit terms in our repository, it takes a very long time because we have hundreds of terms to go through. And so just keep in mind that in this example, it looks really fast and easy, but it's not. Another thing that I wanted to mention when talking about editing your metadata in Islandora is that because it uses linked agents, changing and deleting fields is really, really easy. So going back to Toni Morrison example, let's say you spelled Toni Morrison's name wrong. You put one R instead of two R's, or you spelled it with a Y instead of an I. The really great thing is that all you have to do is go into the taxonomy vocabulary where Toni Morrison lives and update the term. And then it automatically gets updated everything else that uses it. And so it's awesome in that sense. Also, the same thing with deleting. Let's say you're using an outdated subject heading and you want to get rid of it. All you have to do is go into the taxonomy vocabulary and delete it, and it'll delete for everything. And so it's awesome. But one thing I have to say is when you edit in Islandora 8, just be very careful because it is character sensitive. So what I mean by that is that if let's say you're using Workbench to add in new terms like we do at Whitman, if you accidentally add an extra period to the end or an extra space or capitalize a letter or two, or what will happen is that Islandora 8 will add that as a brand new term. And so if you're not careful, you'll come up with a whole bunch of the same terms, just slightly different. The same thing as if you add in terms directly into Islandora 8 taxonomy. If you don't check to make sure the term already exists and you add the term again, it'll appear as if it's two different terms because it has two different nodes attached to it. So basically, this is my way of saying it's really easy to make things messy in Islandora 8, so just be very careful with how you do things.
Okay, yeah, that is all really good information to know. I haven't had yet to manually edit in Islandora 8, so Paige is like the expert on this in our presentation. So I was just going to talk about editing fields in Islandora 8, just kind of how to get there. So if you're in Islandora 8, you need to navigate to structure, content type, and then whatever your entity is named, and then go to manage field, and that's how you get to the editing. For taxonomy, it's really similar, but you want to go to the taxonomy name, hit edit, manage fields. And then I just have a screenshot on the next slide of what it looks like. And the main thing I wanted to talk about here is in particular the help text. This is something we've made a lot of use of at Hopkins Digital Library to give instructions to people who will be filling out our like graphic user interface form, and who might not be like metadata people. They might be like grad students, library workers, or a librarian who's like not really a cataloger or a metadata person. So it just kind of will briefly explain like, what are you supposed to put in this field? And then potentially provide a link to the taxonomy, so they can browse the terms and like see what's there. And this is using the HTML tags, so you can also bold things that you think are important, and then add links and everything like that. So this is like really helpful. You might want to talk to your developer though about like adding help text right in production, because I know for our instance to actually like make permanent changes to the help text, I had to put like a local instance of Islandora 8 on my computer and then make all my edits in the test and then export the config file and then have the developers do what they need to do on GitHub with that. So just check and make sure that the changes you make will be permanent, because I would hate for people to go and add beautiful help text and then have it not stay there forever. And then here, I just wanted to show that this is kind of how that reference entity field works. So here I'm editing a field called spatial coverage, and I've checked that you can only add terms from the vocabulary geographic location. There's also places where you can check off if it's a required field on the form, and then the field visibility and permissions. I'm less clear about what these do. I haven't touched these, but mainly my main point is the help text is awesome, because then when you're filling out your form, you have the instructions like right there. And you don't have to necessarily like reference an external document. Obviously, you don't want to be like super long, so you'll probably still have external documents, maybe giving more information or exceptions or details, but it's just a really nice way to establish like baseline instructions. That way, when people are entering metadata, they're hopefully like kind of on the right path. So yeah, it's been a really great feature that I wish more digital repositories had in general. Oh, joining the community. I just realized I was going to go next. So I was just going to briefly talk about Slack. Join Slack. It's great. I'll put the link in the chat in a second, but there are informal conversations in the metadata channel, like people asking questions. And if you have a question and you don't see it in the documentation, you can always search through the Slack channel history or just ask a new question. People are pretty quick to respond. And then there's also reminders once you're a member of Islandora Slack about meetings. So if there's a certain meeting you want to attend, it's really nice to have those pop-ups to be like, hey, this is happening in an hour.
And also I have to plug the Islandora Metadata Interest Group. We meet every other Friday and yesterday, but typically we meet every other Friday, and we're really open to anybody to join us. So if you're just figuring out what metadata is, if you're a complete expert at Islandora 8, feel free to join us. It is amazing. So I'm biased, but yes, everyone and anyone is welcome. And then we don't have enough time, but we did have links to potential activities. As I mentioned in the conference shared document page, we have a folder, and I did list them. We have a series of templates that I use to help me with our manual cleanup and editing of our data, and that's all available. That's all available there, as well as some messy metadata to play around in. And so that's it. Thank you.
Just to double check, does this end on the hour, or do we still have half an hour?
Just an hour, never mind. So I guess we can, start with questions first, if anybody has any questions, and then we could see if we want to do sandbox stuff or look at messy metadata stuff. So does anybody have any questions for us? So the question was about looking at, it was Whitman specifically, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we were talking about.
Yeah. So the question was about when we go onto Whitman's site, specifically oral histories, it says under creator, or it says under the names, it says linked agent, and you're asking if that's something that could be changed, right? It is something that can be changed. Yeah.
Paige, I don't know if you're seeing the chat question, but we have someone who would love to see more details about global updates to persons' names, authors, etc. The accidental duplication with changes in characters seems worrisome.
I did not see that, sorry, but to answer the question that was here, yes, it is possible. Sorry, not to like completely take your answer, Noah, and just truncate it to very basic, but yes. So what was the question again? Sorry, Michelle.
Oh, no, it was just about global updates and accidental duplication with changes in characters. And I'm not sure if this is like a Workbench specific question, because I think that was a worry for Workbench is based on what you're talking about earlier.
It's not, from my understanding, it's not a Workbench thing.
Oh, okay.
So if I understand right, and Allie, feel free to correct me if I'm misunderstanding. The concern is more about if you have, let's go back to Toni Morrison. If you have Toni Morrison in Islandora 8 and you change the term, there's concern about changing all of the terms. Is that what I'm understanding? Oh, how do you change all the terms? Let me see if I can show that as an example. I have the sandbox up. So the first thing that I want to do is actually, because the sandbox would be a little difficult, but I'm going to try my best. So the first thing we want to do is create a term. So I'm just going to go to person, add a term. I'm going to do Alexander Dumas because I love him. On computer. I spelled that wrong on purpose. First thing I did is I created a term. I'm going to attach it to an object if I can find one. I'm going to attach it to this object. I hope they don't mind. To metadata or the editor, go down to oh, I can never find it. Do we use term merge? We don't, because I'm not exactly sure how to use that. All right, so do you want to come up and say that while I do this? So you can be like this.
I was partly curious and partly also spreading the word. But I'm pretty sure it functions now. The same. Everyone was tagging and people used different terms. Tags. We decided to merge to an authority.
So to kind of give a quick summary of what was being said is that term merge works It's a great tool to use to get rid of duplicates, right? Or misspellings. It's a great tool to use.
Look at
Oh, and Michelle, go ahead and talk if you want, if you have something to add. I'm just trying to quickly collect something together to show how global changes work.
No, I don't have anything to add. I had heard that there was a way to merge terms, and that there's maybe like a Drupal module, but that is all I knew about it.
And term merge is not part of Workbench. It's a Drupal thing. So, all right. So I have created two terms, Alexander Dumas spelled incorrectly. And so let's say I want to, first thing that I like to do is I like to essentially look at all the terms that use Alexander Dumas. So in this case, Alexander Dumas is used in two collections, and in both collections, it is spelt with capital A, capital L. And so what I want to do is I want to go in and change that. So that way it's not capital A, capital L in Alexandry, it's just capital A in Alexandry. So what I would do is, like I said, first I like to have the taxonomy term open so I can actually, the first thing I like to do is have the term open so that I can actually make sure that the change is happening everywhere. So what I would do is I go to the back end, go to taxonomy. I believe I put it in person. And if you forget which taxonomy term you're dealing with, if you go to the page on the top, right up here where it says Alexander Dumas, it'll say person as well. So that's the taxonomy that you're dealing with. So I go to fix this term globally. I go to the person list. I go down and look for Alexander Dumas. And like I was saying earlier, this list is relatively short, but in your own institution's repository, it'll be much longer. We just got lucky because these are on the same page as everything else. So you go here, click edit, quickly change the capital L to lowercase l, go down and push save. And then you can see on the list, it's been updated, so everything looks all pretty. And so here, as of now, it shows capital A, capital L, but when I refresh it, it corrects itself to capital A, lowercase l. If I go into each of the items, it will also be updated as well. So capital A, lowercase l, and here as well, capital A, lowercase l. And so with this, you want to make, with changing terms like this, I would say, and don't bet on me, I would say that the risk factor is relatively low because you're just changing a term, or you're just updating a term. When I go in and let's say I see duplicate terms, so I will create an example of a duplicate term in a different taxonomy. So I will say, I will create a term in taxonomy, same exact name, Alexander Dumas. Same exact characterization, capitalization. So I'm going to save that. And so basically what happens is that now we have Alexander Dumas in the person taxonomy vocabulary and Alexander Dumas in the subject taxonomy vocabulary. So let's say we don't want to use person taxonomy vocabulary. We just want to use Alexander Dumas in the subject vocabulary because it's so much easier to maintain all of our terms in one vocabulary. And so what you would have to do is you would have to go into each of your items. So in this case, we only have 2 items that has Alexandre Dumas and the person vocabulary. And you would essentially have to go in and change those manually. And so what I'm going to do is, because I like being very careful, is I like going back to the term page. So that way I know I'm only dealing with 2 terms. And so what I do is I can either on the back end go into taxonomy terms, go to person because that's where the term lives. I see Alexandre Dumas and I want to delete it. And then it's going to say, are you sure? And I say yes. And so now Alexandre Dumas is no longer in the person taxonomy vocabulary. He does still live in the subject taxonomy vocabulary, so he's not completely gone. And so we're going back to our person term page. I know this, sorry for the terms being really confusing, but we'll go to an item that had Alexandre Dumas as a person, or we'll go to an item that had Alexandre Dumas in the person taxonomy vocabulary, and as you can see, he's missing. And so what that means is that when you delete a term in the back end, like I just did, it'll delete everywhere. And so you want to be very careful when you take a term and you want to move it into one taxonomy into another. I always make sure that I have all those items up. So that way, if I delete the term and I forget what items need that term added, at least they're open in different tabs. And so that's what I would be very careful with, specifically when you're deleting terms or when you're moving things around. And so I hope that was helpful, but that is just my workaround, and there's likely an easier way to do it. I've heard of talk about modules that do taxonomy cleanup, but I'm not familiar with them, but they are there. And I'm sorry if that was a very long explanation to a answer. There should be a way of batch edit metadata.
It's the best. Sorry.
What was it called again?
Views bulk operations. If you can write a view, then you can.
Yeah, I was like, can you say in the mic? Because like, but there is a way to bulk edit.
In the interface, when I have to update metadata across a lot of objects, I use views bulk operations. So I would make a view, configure the view based on your collection membership or whatever it is that you need to do. And then there's a number of actions that are available under views bulk operations. And then you would get a subset of the material that you want to update. So in this case, let's say you want to move your taxonomy term. So you make your new taxonomy term. And I don't know, it looks a little bit, you add a 6 at the end, you've moved it to a new place, but you can see it. You bring up everything that has the taxonomy term already, add the new taxonomy term. I think that the action is called something like entity update or something like that. And then you can change the whole value. And on each of those objects, if you set it up, the revision will be there. So if you need to, so there's a way back. And then once you have everything, once you've added the new term, then you delete your old term. And that way you can be pretty sure that everything is okay. Now with the merging, I just noticed that the merging was fixed. So I haven't tested it, but I'm enthusiastic because that was broken. That's another thing where you can, you can create your new term and then merge merge your old term into the new term, and then it would all be updated.
That's amazing.
So that's 2 things in one, but views bulk operations is definitely, see, I use views for everything. Like views is you invest a little bit of time in learning views, and then you feel like, I don't know, what's that thing about a lever? If I had a lever big enough, I could shift the world. If I can build a view that will do anything to data. That's what I feel like. Sorry, thank you for having me.
I was like, I'm definitely gonna write that down on my list of things to look at.
Yeah. Really good.
Yeah.
So, I'm wondering.
Yep.
Thank you for having me.
I was actually hearing from Michelle about your wonderful presentation and the process of putting it together. And at one point, Michelle, you slacked me and you said that you had been talking about the unique IDs, our use of unique IDs. And so I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, like what are the unique IDs and why were they so important to our ingest process?
Yeah, so the unique IDs came around because when we were using our quad entity reference system to create the links between our different spreadsheets, we realized that just using title or name was not sufficient because we had, for instance, repository items named the same thing. Like we have like a bunch of maps of Baltimore from various dates, but the same exact name. So that means when the migrate module would try to look it up, it might just select the first one, it might give an error. Essentially, having the same name means that it wouldn't be able to accurately link the medias to their correct repository items. And that could also come up if people had the same name or something. Like it could come up in a variety of ways. So what we ended up doing is creating these local unique IDs that are stored in Drupal. And they are created when we create items using the GUI. But mainly we make them for the ingest process and we can just bulk make them. There's a lot of like websites, if you like Google create UUID version 4, there are different websites that will generate them for you and will generate 500 at a time. I have a Python script that if you put all your files in a folder, it will add a unique ID column to all of your files. And essentially that just ensures that what we're referencing is always going to be unique. And then it's not dependent on typing out the name or the title as well. So it does reduce human error because spacing, commas, becomes not a factor because it's just looking for that unique ID. So that has been a really great way for our spreadsheets to interlink with each other. It isn't the most readable thing in the world, but it's really nice to be able to only have all of your taxonomy term values in one spot. So even if I have the same subject in my repository item spreadsheet assigned like 800 times, I don't have to type it out 800 times. It's one row in the taxonomy subject spreadsheet, and then I'm just referencing it by that unique ID. And you might be thinking, but don't you have to type out the unique ID 800 times? Well, potentially, yes. I do have a script that lets you enter in things manually, or when you have your subjects in your spreadsheet, it will flip between the name and the unique ID for viewability. So that's been a nice aspect. So if I want someone to review a sheet, but I know that looking at the unique IDs will make their brain melt, I can use that Python script to grab all of the names and temporarily put them in a spreadsheet for just reviewing purposes. So I hope that helps explain how the unique IDs are really helpful. It's a great way to ensure that we only have to verify the spelling of data in one spot during our migration module and during our ingest, and that we don't have to worry necessarily about like human error as much, because our goal when we were creating the migration module and why it uses like a GUI instead of a command line is to have it just be as user-friendly as possible to people who might not feel comfortable with more techie solutions. So eventually I do think people will be creating these by hand. Right now, when we did our 5 pilot collections, I mainly used Python for a lot of bulk editing. So I didn't really touch a lot of values manually, but eventually that will happen. And I do think this reduces error. And it was the best solution we could come up with to solve that problem. Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question, Katie?
Where are you maintaining your list of term IDs and identifiers?
Yes.
Oh, that is a great question. So all of our unique IDs are stored, as I said, in Islandora, but we have an export. So it will export all of the data out of the entities exactly in the format that you need to migrate it in. So if I have a collection that uses some old taxonomy terms, I can export, my people taxonomy terms and then find the ones I need and use their unique IDs. So that has been a really handy feature. Bethany Seeger built that export feature. And it also means that if I need to make bulk updates, let's say to all my corporate bodies, I can do my export of all my corporate bodies, make changes in my spreadsheet, and just put that same exact spreadsheet back in our migration module, and then re-ingest it, and it will just fix whatever changes I made, and it will tell you how many terms were changed as well. So we don't actually need to keep track of any of the unique IDs ourselves, which was actually a big point in the development process, because at one point the developers thought that maybe we would have to keep track, the metadata librarians. I was like, that is unrealistic. We will never be successful, which makes us sound bad, but we have so many things to keep track of. It needs to be in a repository. You can't just be floating on a spreadsheet. We do intend, though, just as a data backup, to have our migration spreadsheets, at least from the pilot collection, on a repo in GitHub, and potentially just keep data there in spreadsheets as a backup. So yeah, I don't know if that answers questions. And then there's also other ways you can get information out of Drupal. I also have experimented with the JSON API, and it's fairly easy to get all your information from taxonomies out using the JSON API in a sustained, easy way. I haven't done as much with repository items because it's a little bit more complex to get those out using the JSON API, but that's another possibility if you don't have an export, which is also something I think we should contribute back to the community, is the CSV export that Bethany made, but we have not done that yet. It is a hope, though, of mine that we do it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or anything anybody wants to see in the sandbox? I say with hesitation. Great. Well, thank you. As I said earlier, we will be sharing our slides later on. And so we wanted to say thank you. I don't want to speak for you, Michelle, but I assume you want to say thank you as well. But thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to either of us. Our information is also wrong computer. Our information is also on our slides as well. And yeah, thank you.